In the summer of 1993, a small Appalachian town prepared for its annual church fair. Families gathered under fading daylight, children won prizes, and the night closed with hymn recitals tucked into folded programs. At 9 p.m., 16-year-old Lydia Mercer left the fairgrounds. She chose a shortcut through a valley the locals quietly called Cursed Hollow. She never arrived home. The next morning, search teams swept the thicket. They found only a single canvas shoe, damp with mud, and no other trace. Whispers grew louder than evidence. Neighbors stopped speaking. The forest was said to consume its own. Decades later, sealed evidence boxes revealed items overlooked: scraps of paper, a pendant, a torn fair ticket. Artifacts that forced investigators and outsiders to reopen a silence the town had guarded for years. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The summer fair had always been the most ordinary ritual of the town. By late July, Appalachian heat pressed heavy against the ridges, but the church lot filled anyway. Families gathered under canvas tents where the scent of fried dough and roasted corn drifted across gravel. Children lined up for raffles, their palms sticky from lemonade. A brass band played uneven hymns, and when the evening service ended, folded programs scattered across benches like autumn leaves arriving early. On the night of July 17, 1993, 16-year-old Lydia Mercer moved through that crowd without urgency. She was dressed plainly: a faded denim jacket, canvas shoes scuffed from use, hair pinned back by a blue clip. In one hand, she carried the leftover raffle ticket stubs. In the other, a folded church program she had stuffed into her pocket after the final hymn. Neighbors later said she was smiling, though in a tired way, as though the heat had pulled everything slower. At 9 p.m., she stepped away from the main road. Her parents, Daniel and Martha, were busy helping pack chairs into the church hall, assuming she would wait for them. Instead, Lydia cut toward the edge of the field where a dirt path slipped into the trees. The path was a known shortcut, saving nearly 20 minutes between the church and the Mercers' farmhouse. It cut through a narrow valley with steep walls, a place locals whispered about but rarely entered after dark. They called it Cursed Hollow. The hollow looked ordinary by daylight: ferns, sycamores, the ruin of a coal tram half buried in moss. Yet the stories attached to it were heavier than the rocks themselves. Miners trapped in the collapse of the 1930s, fires that burned underground for weeks, strange echoes that rattled in the night. Parents told children not to play there, though some did anyway, daring each other to run through without stopping. That evening, Lydia walked toward it alone. A neighbor, Jonah Pike, swore later he saw her silhouette pausing at the tree line, adjusting her jacket. Then she disappeared between the first two poplars. The carnival noise dimmed behind her. Cicadas droned. The hollow closed in. By dawn, the Mercers realized she had not come home. Martha phoned the sheriff at 6 a.m., voice breaking. "She's not in her bed. She never made it back." Sheriff Ray Dillard arrived within the hour, a stout man with a flashlight swinging from his belt. Deputies spread through the field, still littered with paper cups and ribbons damp from dew. The dirt path showed faint scuff marks. 100 yards in, the air grew colder, the smell of wet earth thick. Dillard's beam landed on a pale object pressed into the mud. A single canvas shoe, its side stained dark, laces half untied. No drag marks. No prints beyond the muddled shuffle of volunteers already stomping through. The deputies sealed the shoe in a clear bag, labeling it Evidence 1, left canvas shoe, mud-soaked. The search expanded. Dozens of volunteers formed lines, calling her name. Hounds strained at their leads, circling with low whines, but refusing to pull forward. One team reported hearing metallic bangs echoing from the cliffs, like doors slamming underground. The sound was logged in a search report but never explained. By dusk the first day, they had found nothing else. At the Mercer home, a vigil began almost immediately. Neighbors brought casseroles, sat in silence. Martha left Lydia's laundry folded on the kitchen chair, the Sunday dress she had worn still hanging by the door. On the porch, Daniel lit a lantern that burned until dawn, scanning the ridgeline as if light itself might draw his daughter back. On the second day, word shifted from worry to legend. Some whispered the hollow had taken someone again, the first time in years. Older residents muttered that the ground beneath was never safe, that voices carried up from tunnels that no longer existed. The Mercers rejected this as cruelty, but it spread faster than the search reports. Belief offered an answer where fact did not. Sheriff Dillard pushed his team to comb deeper, but terrain slowed them. Ferns rose waist-high, streams cut across the path, and every ridge resembled another. They marked their progress on a wide paper map pinned to the hood of a cruiser. Red ink lines showed the areas cleared. Blank spaces remained. Deep gullies, uncharted shafts, thickets, too dense. Rumor filled the gaps where their markers did not reach. Clara Rowe, an outsider who would arrive decades later to reassemble these fragments, often described this first week as a duel between silence and noise. Silence from the ground itself, which gave no body, no scrap of clothing beyond the shoe. Noise from the people, who offered stories about flickering lights, phantom singing, or miners wandering back. The evidence was thin, the folklore thick. Through it all, one object remained consistent: the folded church program Lydia had tucked into her jacket. Some said they saw a page caught against the roots at the edge of the hollow, though no officer logged it. Others insisted it must have blown away. By week's end, it became less a piece of paper than a symbol of what was lost. Families left their own programs folded at the church altar, a ritual gesture of solidarity or fear. An ordinary slip of paper turning slowly into something else. When the first week closed with no body, Sheriff Dillard placed the canvas shoe on a shelf in the evidence room. He logged the date and time in blunt handwriting, noting no further trace. For him, it was the start of a case file. For the community, it was the start of a legend that grew in the absence of answers. The carnival lights were gone. The laughter had thinned into silence. And in the dark soil of the hollow, a single canvas shoe glowed faint under the moon. By the second morning, the town had shifted into a kind of ritual. Lines of volunteers gathered at the church lot, signing their names on a clipboard as deputies handed out flashlights and orange vests. The sun rose heavy over the ridges, burning mist off the grass. Sheriff Dillard unrolled a large county map on the hood of his cruiser. He marked squares with red pencil, dividing the hollow into sectors. Searchers whispered about the place as if naming it out loud might summon something worse. The hollow swallowed them quickly. Ferns slapped against legs. Briars tugged at sleeves. Men and women called Lydia's name in uneven rhythms, the echoes bouncing oddly off the rock walls. More than one searcher swore the sound came back doubled, as if a second voice was repeating her name from deeper inside. By midday, a deputy logged a strange report. A dull clang reverberating through the cliffs. Metallic, like a sheet of iron dropped, the note read. Some said it came from the collapsed mine tunnels that honeycombed beneath the hollow. Others shook their heads, muttering about doors that opened for the cursed. The report was filed, but no follow-up was ordered. The heat pressed hard by afternoon. Dogs grew restless, turning in circles. Their handlers pulled them forward, but the hounds whined, sniffing at nothing. One broke its leash and bolted back toward the church lot, tail tucked. Its handler cursed, then refused to bring it back inside the hollow. For a town that leaned on working animals, the refusal carried weight. That evening, volunteers lit lanterns along the edge of the trail, an improvised perimeter. They lingered there longer than they admitted, unwilling to step past once the sun dropped. It was then that the first red herring appeared. Two boys returning from the search claimed they had seen torchlight bobbing deep in the hollow. Excited, deputies went back in, scouring the ravines for any campfire or trespasser. They found nothing, only a smear of light bouncing from another search team's lanterns. The mistake was never announced, but the story spread in town as though Lydia had been lured by flames. At the Mercer home, Martha Mercer gripped a chair until her knuckles whitened. She refused food, refused sleep. On the kitchen table, she laid out one of the folded church programs from the fair. It was not Lydia's, but another that she had found among the discarded stacks. She set it upright against the salt shaker, as if waiting for a message to appear on the page. Neighbors joined her in silence, their tea cooling, their eyes fixed on that slip of paper, a routine object turning into ritual. The sheriff's office kept logging details, approximate search distances, marked maps, lists of volunteers. But the more the file thickened, the less anyone trusted it. In town, the stories swelled larger than the maps. They spoke of women decades earlier who vanished near the same trail, of songs drifting out of the trees at dusk. Outsider Clara Rowe, reconstructing the case years later, noted how quickly fact and folklore braided together, indistinguishable in the record. By the third night, the hollow itself felt like a boundary. On one side, lawmen with flashlights, pencils, maps. On the other, a darkness that gave back only echoes. No body, no clothing, no explanation beyond the single shoe sealed in plastic. The deputies began returning early, their reports thinner. The final log of that week described continuing auditory anomalies, clang of indeterminate origin, area unsearched beyond creek line. It ended with a phrase underlined twice: no further leads. Lanterns dimmed, families drifted back home, but whispers said the hollow was not finished. The clang of unseen metal rang once, then died into silence. By the end of the first week, the Mercers' farmhouse had turned into a gathering point. Neighbors left casseroles by the door, though most of the food went untouched. Martha Mercer taped a photograph of Lydia to the porch post, a simple school picture with uneven bangs and a half smile. She lit a candle beside it, the wax spilling across the railing. Every night after, the candle was replaced, until the porch smelled faintly of burnt wicks. In town, missing posters multiplied. Telephone poles sprouted with Lydia's face. Handwritten notes beneath them read, "Keep praying," or "Safe return." At the post office, a clerk stapled a flyer right above the scale where envelopes were weighed. The girl's eyes stared back at everyone who mailed a letter. It was during this flood of paper that another strange detail surfaced. On the second week, Martha received a folded church program in the mail. No envelope, no return address, just the paper folded into thirds, smeared with rainwater. The program matched those handed out at the fair the night Lydia vanished. The hymns inside were the same, but the corners were warped, and faint mud stained one edge. It arrived like a message with no sender. She showed it to Sheriff Dillard, who shrugged. "Probably one that blew loose and somebody thought you should have it," he said. But Martha tucked it away as if it were a relic. By contrast, Sheriff Dillard's reports remained dry. He logged tips that poured in, most useless. One caller swore they saw a girl matching Lydia's description walking beside the highway 2 counties over. Another claimed she had been taken by travelers who sometimes camped near the ridge. Deputies checked both leads. Nothing came of them. The case file thickened with false sightings. Outsider Clara Rowe, years later, would highlight the contradiction. The official record was swollen with dead ends, while the community memory thinned into silence. People stopped answering questions. At the grocery store, conversations fell quiet when the hollow was mentioned. By autumn, even friends of the Mercers avoided the subject, leaving dishes at the porch and retreating without knocking. But beneath that silence, belief continued to spread. Children dared each other to ride bikes to the hollow's edge, leaving folded slips of paper under rocks. Parents collected those scraps in secret, burning them in backyard pits. Some said it was an offering. Others said it kept the valley from calling another name. In the police files, one forensic note stood out. On July 22nd, 5 days after Lydia vanished, the sheriff's office logged multiple calls about unexplained lights near the hollow between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. Witnesses described them as white flashes low to the ground. Deputies dispatched to the area found nothing. They logged the report, underlined possible search team overlap, and moved on. But the rumor persisted that something had been signaling in the trees. The divide grew sharper. paper maps and call logs in the evidence room, folded programs and whispered stories in kitchens. Each side claimed truth, yet neither provided answers. Clara Rowe, reconstructing the story decades later, placed one of the surviving church programs on her desk. She noticed the creases, the moisture damage, the fragile ink. She imagined Martha's hand smoothing it flat, treating it as more than paper. In her notes she wrote, "Symbol mistaken for message, absence mistaken for proof." The town retreated, the search shrank, and the hollow remained untouched, its trail damp and narrow. The last place Lydia Mercer had been seen. The paper lay torn and wet, clinging to roots at the tree line. By August, the case had slowed into a rhythm of rumor. Official search parties dwindled. Volunteers returned to their farms and shifts at the mill. The sheriff's office still received calls, but the urgency had drained. Without new evidence, everything hinged on talk. It was then that Jonah Pike stepped forward. A boy of 18, known mostly for leaning against the gas station wall with friends, he told deputies that he had seen Lydia the night of the fair. He swore she wasn't alone. According to him, 2 other boys walked beside her as she turned toward the hollow. "Couldn't see faces," Jonah said, "but they weren't strangers, from around here." For days, the town buzzed. Parents whispered names, pairing Lydia with classmates, building theories from memory fragments. It was a red herring that carried weight. If Lydia had gone willingly with others, then maybe the hollow wasn't to blame. The sheriff pressed Jonah for details, but within a week his story changed. He said he might have been mistaken. "Could have been shadows," he muttered, refusing to sign a statement. Some believed he had been pressured to stay quiet. Others thought he was inventing a story for attention. The lead evaporated. Still, gossip clung to it. Some claimed Lydia had been planning to run off with a secret boyfriend. A few pointed fingers at farmhands who had already left town for seasonal work, safe beyond questioning. These suspicions offered a simple narrative: teen rebellion, bad company, yet none fit the evidence. Lydia's room at home was untouched. Her diary mentioned nothing of escape, and only the one shoe remained, lying in the mud like a silent contradiction. At the Mercer house, Martha began collecting church programs from every Sunday service after Lydia vanished. She stacked them neatly in a drawer, each folded exactly in half. Neighbors noticed her habit, treating it like a ritual of grief. Outsider Clara Rowe later wrote that what began as an ordinary paper handout became a kind of vigil, symbols of prayers unanswered, a stack of silent witnesses. Meanwhile, the sheriff's evidence room added a new item. During a secondary sweep, a deputy found a strand of brown hair snagged on a low branch near the trail. It was bagged, sealed, and stored. Tests at the time were limited. No DNA comparison was possible in the small county lab. The report simply logged, hair, long, brown, source, unknown. For the Mercer family, it was devastating. Lydia had brown hair, tied back with a blue clip that night. Yet without confirmation, it became just another object in the file, trapped between proof and possibility. Belief took its own path. Some residents whispered that the hollow marked anyone who entered, leaving fragments behind. A shoe, a strand of hair, enough to remind the living, never enough to return the lost. Jonah Pike avoided town for weeks. He lingered at the edges of football games, stared at the ground when asked questions. In Clara's later reconstruction, she noted how his shifting account illustrated the border between rumor and record. A single testimony that swayed suspicion, then collapsed into doubt. By fall, the case had 2 competing shapes. The official file, with its bagged hair and recorded sightings, sat locked in the evidence cabinet, and the town's folklore, swelling each time someone whispered, "The hollow took her," spread like mist across the ridges. Both versions were incomplete. Both left Lydia absent. The leaves turned red, then fell. The church programs kept stacking in Martha's drawer, and in the sheriff's locker, a sealed plastic bag held a strand of hair no one would ever test again for years. A single strand curled tight in plastic, sealed against the air. Winter came early that year, pressing the ridges with frost. By then, the hollow had taken on the weight of myth. The sheriff's office maintained a file, slim and unsatisfying, but the community carried a heavier story. At church gatherings, people lowered their voices when the hollow was mentioned. Candles burned longer during evening services. The name Lydia was whispered as both prayer and warning. A decade later, when Clara Rowe began piecing the case together as an outsider, she started with those silences. She sat in living rooms where curtains stayed drawn, listening to older residents speak only after long pauses. "We told our children not to walk that way," said Edna Crowell, one of the town's oldest women. Her hands shook as she passed Clara a faded photograph of miners from 1931, their faces caked with coal dust. "That valley was dug hollow long before your girl ever went missing. They never sealed it right. The mine collapse had killed 11 men. Officially, the shafts were abandoned, but locals swore the tunnels still ran beneath the valley. Stories of muffled voices, phantom lights, even pockets of fire smoldering underground lingered for generations. Some families still avoided planting near the ridges, believing the soil unclean. Clara compared these accounts with the sheriff's reports. In one box, she found a folded blueprint of the old mine, the paper browned at the edges. Red ink traced the locations of ventilation shafts, several aligned exactly beneath Cursed Hollow. The drawing had been filed away in 1993, never followed up. Dillard's note on the margin read only, "No safe access." Forensic record and folklore intersected here. The town described the hollow as cursed ground. The blueprint proved there was fractured earth below, unstable and uncharted. Yet neither explained Lydia's absence. The duality persisted, myth filling where evidence could not reach. Meanwhile, the Mercer's grief continued its quiet ritual. Martha began leaving a folded church program at the edge of the hollow each Sunday after service. Neighbors sometimes joined her, placing their own slips of paper in the grass. To them, it was not evidence, but offering. Clara later wrote that the paper's meaning had shifted. Once a simple schedule of hymns, now a token bridging the line between prayer and superstition. In the case file, the church program surfaced differently. A deputy's handwritten note from July 18th, the day after Lydia vanished, mentioned she had last been observed carrying folded program. The paper itself was never logged into evidence. It existed only in absence, seen, not collected. Years later, that absence became louder than presence, as though the missing paper itself was an artifact. During her interviews, Clara asked repeatedly whether anyone had searched deeper into the tunnels. Responses came in fragments. One former volunteer said a group of men had tried, but the air was too foul, the beams too unstable. Another swore no such attempt was ever made. Each version contradicted the next, leaving Clara with a mosaic of half-memories. One rumor claimed that strange chanting was heard from the hollow during the second night of searching. When Clara pressed for names, no one agreed. Some said it was the voices of miners echoing. Others insisted it was the wind funneled through broken shafts. The sheriff's logs contained nothing. Myth outweighed record once again. Clara held on to the blueprint, tracing her finger along the red-inked shafts. She imagined Lydia's steps aligning with those broken lines. A living girl moving over the bones of collapsed tunnels. The thought unsettled her, though she noted it carefully in her journal. Belief speaks of curses, but paper proves collapse. The hollow remained fenced only by warning, never by wire. Children were told not to play there, yet footprints still appeared in the mud after rain. To the town, it was forbidden and sacred at once, a place where myth explained what police reports could not. That dual narrative shaped everything. In the Mercer home, folded programs stacked high in a drawer, tangible and heavy. In the evidence room, a map of tunnels sat ignored, paper brittle but precise. Both were forms of paper, both recorded, yet one was treated as holy and the other as hazard. Lydia herself remained absent in both. By the time Clara finished her notes for that section of the story, dusk had settled over the ridges. She walked to the edge of the hollow, holding one of the programs Martha had once left there. The air smelled of wet leaves and stone. She set the paper down on a stump, the ink already smudging from mist. For a moment, it looked like nothing, a scrap to be blown away. For a moment, it looked like everything. the blueprint and the prayer slip folded into the same silence. Winter of 1993 pressed heavy on the Mercer family. Snow layered across the ridges, muting every sound but the crunch of boots. Search parties had ended, deputies had turned to other cases, but Daniel Mercer kept walking the trail into the hollow day after day. He carried a lantern even at noon, convinced he might find a trace overlooked. Martha stood on the porch waiting for him, fingers pressed white against the railing. One evening in January, Daniel never returned. His truck slid on black ice along a ridge road and overturned. The sheriff's report described it as an accident. In town, people whispered differently. Some said the hollow had claimed another Mercer. At the funeral, Reverend Paul Henson read from one of the same church programs Lydia had carried at the fair. He held it aloft as though it were scripture, though its paper edges were creased and smudged. Clara Rowe, revisiting decades later, looked at the photographs from that funeral. Lydia's school portrait propped against the pulpit, Daniel's casket draped with a quilt. But what caught her attention was the background. Through the church window, the outline of the hollow's ridge pressed against a pale winter sky. In one photograph, a shadow seemed to stretch out from those trees, a black streak reaching the edge of the frame. Archivists called it nothing more than light exposure. Yet to the family, it was evidence. The hollow had been present, even there. For Martha, the rituals multiplied. She no longer attended Sunday service without taking 2 programs, one for herself, one for Lydia. She stacked them in the drawer until the wood bowed beneath their weight. Neighbors began to notice. Some joined in, quietly placing their own programs at the altar and leaving them behind. Soon, a drawer in the church vestibule overflowed with folded slips, hymn lists turned into tokens of grief. The sheriff's office logged only silence. No new leads surfaced in the months after Daniel's death. A deputy added a single line to the file. Family suffering continued hardship. That was all. But in town, the stories grew louder. Some said Daniel's crash was no accident, that headlights without source had blinded him on the ridge road. Others whispered he had been lured toward the hollow again, though his truck never left the pavement. These accounts never reached paper, but Clara heard them repeated by 3 separate witnesses when she returned years later. She noted how quickly folklore filled absence, how each silence became space for invention. At the Mercer home, Martha kept vigil. She sat at the kitchen table long into the night, a stack of programs beside her, sometimes tearing one into strips and laying them in rows as if arranging evidence. Clara later found one of these strips pressed in a family Bible. The ink of the hymns, faint but legible. The ordinary object had shifted again, no longer only ritual but artifact of grief, archived by the grieving themselves. Forensic touches surfaced in unexpected places. A parishioner gave Clara a photograph he had taken at Daniel's funeral. In the lower corner, faint and blurred, a figure seemed to stand outside the church doorway, half in shadow. The archivist marked it as lens flare, but Clara noted the resemblance of the figure's height and shape to a teenage girl. She logged it carefully, not as proof, but as echo. The hollow loomed larger in absence. No official investigation went there after January. The trail grew over with ice. Branches sagged under snow. When spring thaw arrived, the valley smelled of wet stone and rot. Children dared one another to ride bicycles past the entrance, tossing stones into the dark. Some swore the stones never landed, that they fell into an endless pit. Adults shook their heads but never corrected them. Martha's grief hardened into ritual. Every Sunday she carried the drawer of programs to the church basement, binding them with string. She marked each bundle with the date, a ledger of loss written in folded paper. Outsider Clara, examining those bundles decades later, treated them like forensic exhibits. She wore gloves, lifting one tied with twine, noting how the ink had bled from candle smoke. In her notes she wrote, "Paper is prayer, paper is record, both stacked, both unanswering." The official file, meanwhile, stagnated. The hair sample remained sealed, untested. The shoe sat on a shelf. The note about metallic echoes in the hollow never received follow-up. Each item, static and lifeless, reflected only neglect. Folklore, by contrast, flourished. One resident swore she saw Lydia walking near the creek weeks after the fair, her face pale, her dress soaked. Another claimed the girl's laughter was heard near the mine shafts, drifting in and out with the wind. Sheriff Dillard wrote none of this down, but when Clara interviewed him years later, his silence told its own story. He closed the file without answering. By 1994, the Mercer family was reduced to Martha alone, her house stacked with paper, her nights lit by candles. The town shifted back into routine, but no one walked through the hollow without glancing twice. The balance between belief and fact tilted further toward belief. The record ended with a shadow in a photograph, a pile of folded programs, and a silence deeper than the mine shafts themselves. In the funeral photo, a black streak stretched toward the casket. By the summer of 1996, the hollow had become a place teenagers dared each other to enter. The official search had long since ended, and the adults had folded silence around the valley. But silence draws curiosity. One humid evening, 3 boys, the Collins brothers and their cousin, brought a disposable camera, a pack of matches, and bravado into the hollow. They promised each other they would walk to the center, touch the rusted remains of the old tram line, and return before midnight. The path was overgrown, weeds pulling at their jeans, insects rising in clouds. Still, they pressed forward, convinced that proof of their courage would earn them stories to trade at school. What they found unsettled them. Near a flat clearing where charred stumps leaned, they discovered scraps of fabric scorched black. The material looked like cotton, but it reeked of oil, heavy and chemical. One boy kicked at it and recoiled. Ash clung to his boot. They snapped a photograph, but the flash only captured smoke haze and shadows. Later, when they showed the picture, nothing clear appeared. The next morning, the boys took the scraps to Sheriff Dillard. He bagged them, logged them as burnt fabric, unknown source, and sent a note to the state lab. Weeks passed before results returned. The report concluded the material contained traces of industrial lubricant, the kind used in mining equipment. No direct tie to Lydia was established. The deputies closed the note with a shrug, likely debris, unrelated. Yet in the hollow, the rumor shifted. The fabric became something else, evidence of ritual. Children whispered that offerings had been burned, that Lydia's belongings had been set aflame to keep her from returning. Belief took the chemical smell and bent it into curse. At church the following Sunday, Martha Mercer left another folded program at the altar. A neighbor noticed she had scrawled Lydia's name across the top margin. This was new. Until then, the programs had been untouched, blank except for the printed hymns. Slowly, the community began doing the same. Names of lost relatives, unsolved illnesses, unanswered prayers filled the margins of those slips. What had once been ordinary paper transformed into a ledger of fear. Clara Rowe, reviewing the burnt fabric decades later, kept it pressed under glass at the archives. Even then, faint oil stains bled across the weave. In her notes, she wrote, "Belief saw ritual. Forensics saw industry. Both remain unproven, but the appearance of the fabric had another effect." For the first time since the early days, the sheriff's office reopened the hollow for a controlled sweep. Deputies with masks and gloves traced the valley edges. They mapped sinkholes, photographed rusted beams, and carried soil samples. Yet none of it touched Lydia's trail. The shoe remained the only definitive link. The hair remained sealed, untested. Everything else was debris. The Collins brothers grew uneasy with the attention. They had hoped for notoriety, but instead, suspicion clung to them. People muttered that they had planted the fabric to stir trouble. Others whispered they had seen more that night and kept it quiet. The brothers denied everything, but Clara, years later, noted how they had become unwilling participants in the town's narrative. Boys who had gone looking for courage and returned with a stain that never washed off. In the evidence room, the burnt fabric sat folded into a paper sleeve. In the church vestibule, folded programs thickened, now carrying handwriting across their margins. Both piles grew, each holding weight, neither bringing Lydia closer. Martha continued her ritual. She carried programs in her purse, leaving them not only at church but sometimes at the hollow's edge. More than one passerby reported seeing slips of paper caught in roots, damp and curling. Some collected them and returned them to her. Others left them there as part of the landscape. Belief had turned paper into offering, and offerings into evidence of their own. By 1997, the hollow was spoken of less as a place and more as a boundary. Children were told not to cross it. Teenagers still did, daring each other, but never without fear. Every scuff of fabric, every scrap of ash became a reminder. Fact and belief were inseparable now. Clara Rowe, building her narrative years later, described Section 7 of her notes with a single line. The valley gave back fragments, but never the girl. And in the sheriff's file, the entry for that summer ended bluntly. Material tested, no match, case status unchanged. Between the two, a silence stretched wide. The fabric smoldered in memory, blackened edges curling like a prayer. By the early 2000s, the hollow had become both forbidden ground and tourist curiosity. Hunters avoided it, but hikers sometimes stumbled close, only to be turned back by locals shaking their heads. The town had stopped speaking Lydia's name in public, but the story lingered like fog in the valleys. Outsider Clara Rowe arrived in 2003, determined to walk the ground herself. She met Elias Boone, a retired hunter who had volunteered during the first searches. Boone's cabin stood at the edge of the ridge, filled with racks of rifles, animal pelts, and a stack of weathered journals. He was reluctant at first, but Clara carried credentials and persistence. At his kitchen table, with coffee cooling in chipped mugs, he opened a journal from July 1993. His handwriting, shaky but clear, described something no report had mentioned. Found tracks small, like girls, near stream. Tracks ended sudden at Boulder Field. No drag, no blood. Boone had circled the note twice. Clara turned the page, slowly. Between the entries lay a folded slip of paper, yellowed and brittle. It was a church program, creased into quarters, tucked there as if he couldn't let it go. Boone explained that on the second day of searching, he had followed the hounds up to the Boulder Field. He saw the prints himself, barely visible in the soft earth. But when the ground hardened into stone, they stopped. Like she walked right into the rock, he muttered. He told the deputies then, but they had waved him off, chalking it to erosion. He had kept the memory in his journal, slipping the program in as a marker. Clara wrote in her notes, "Duality sharpened. Belief says the hollow consumes. Fact shows footprints stopping without cause." She photographed the page, the folded paper, the fading ink. Together they hiked to the site. The hollow had changed little. Trees loomed close, moss clung to rocks. The stream trickled shallow under a canopy of leaves. Boone pointed to the boulder field where the prints had ended. Clara crouched, touching the stone, smooth, featureless. No trace of what he had seen. Only his journal, and the folded paper within preserved the memory. The town, by then, had learned to ignore questions. Clara knocked on doors, but most responses were polite refusals. "We've told all we know," one woman said before closing her curtains. Others offered her food, but not words. A librarian admitted quietly, "It's not the kind of thing we talk about anymore." Still, fragments surfaced. A clerk at the hardware store said he remembered strange chalk marks found on a tree near the hollow that summer. He described them as circles within circles, like targets. Deputies had photographed them, but the images never appeared in the case file Clara reviewed. Folklore claimed they were symbols miners once carved to ward off collapse. Believers said they were warnings. Clara requested the sheriff's office records directly. The clerk on duty rolled out boxes of paper, thin from neglect. She sifted through search logs, call sheets, and evidence receipts. There was no mention of chalk symbols, no mention of Boone's footprints, no trace of the folded paper programs that had multiplied in ritual. The absence was louder than the reports themselves. The contrast between folklore and forensic became starker. In Boone's journals, footprints ended where rock began. In official files, there were no footprints at all. In town, people spoke of curses. In the evidence room, the only words were, "No further leads." Martha Mercer, by then, lived alone. Clara visited her one evening, finding the house dim, every drawer packed with stacks of folded programs bound with string. They filled the dining room like archives, bundles marked with dates. "Each one's a prayer," Martha said softly, touching a stack. To her, they were not clutter but record, proof of a vigil that had never ended. Clara understood. The ordinary slips had become sacred, their repetition a ledger of grief. That night, Clara walked to the hollow's edge with Boone. The air was damp, cicadas droning. They stood in silence, lantern light brushing across the stone. "Sometimes I think the land itself swallows what it wants," Boone said. Clara only noted the detail, witness belief stronger than record, program as relic, not evidence. The sheriff's office closed their logbook for the year without new entries, but Boone's journal, Martha's stacks, and the town's whispers told a different version. Two parallel records, never reconciled. When Clara returned to her motel, she spread the photographs on the bed. Boone's journal, the folded program, the blueprint of the mine shafts she had copied earlier. Paper upon paper, each telling a different story. She wondered which version would survive longer, the one in boxes, stamped unsolved, or the one spoken in whispers, passed like legend. She wrote her final line for the chapter that night. Fact ends in footprints on stone. Belief says the stone moved. The trail of prints stopped at rock, fading into nothingness. By the early 2000s, the Mercer family house stood almost empty of voices. Daniel was gone, Lydia absent, and Martha moved quietly through rooms stacked with bundles of paper tied in twine. She rarely spoke to neighbors anymore. Some described her as hollowed out, like the valley itself. Clara Rowe filed a request at the State Archives in 2005. After weeks of delay, a clerk rolled out a cardboard box with a faded case number. Dust clung to the lid. Clara signed her name on the log sheet and opened it under fluorescent lights. Inside were objects logged but never analyzed. A chain of silver tarnished with green spots, a fare ticket torn diagonally, and a folded, water-stained church program. The inventory slip inside read, "Recovered near Hollow Entrance, July 20th, 1993. Stored pending analysis. No follow-up." Clara stared at the handwriting, sharp, hurried, as though the deputy had wanted to close the page quickly. She lifted the chain first. It was delicate, with a small pendant in the shape of a heart. Engraved on the back was a single initial, J. Clara's breath caught. She remembered testimony years earlier from Jonah Pike, the boy who had changed his story about Lydia walking with others that night. Rumor once claimed he had given her a necklace. If this was his, then why had it sat for years untouched? The fare ticket was easier. Red ink, smudged by water, numbers almost unreadable. Clara held it to the light and saw part of a hymn lyric scrawled on the back in pencil. It looked like a teenager's handwriting. Another fragment of paper, another trace of ritual. Finally, she unfolded the program. The hymns listed were the same as every other copy, but across the bottom margin, faint and smeared, was a single word written in blue ink, faith. The three items together deepened the divide between fact and belief. Official records saw them as evidence, neglected and forgotten. To the town, they became mythic, tokens of curse, whispers of ritual. Clara placed each into new archival sleeves, careful with gloves, and photographed them under sterile light. Forensic analysis in the 2000s had improved, but when the chain was swabbed, results came back inconclusive. The tarnish obscured any DNA trace. The fare ticket carried nothing usable. Only the program yielded anything at all. Residue of soil and faint traces of skin oil, too degraded for comparison. Artifact with limited probative value, the lab wrote. Yet the symbolic weight grew heavier. In Martha's house, stacks of programs marked the years of waiting. In the archives, one damp program had become Exhibit 12A. Paper had traveled from pocket to prayer to evidence. This was also when suspicion turned sharply back toward Jonah Pike. The engraved J seemed too direct to ignore. Locals muttered that maybe the hollow had not acted alone, that boys, jealous or reckless, had led Lydia inside. Clara interviewed Jonah, now older, his eyes shadowed. He denied the necklace. "Wasn't mine. People will believe what they want." But his words carried no conviction. He glanced down each time she asked, his hands twisting. The rumors swelled again. Some claimed Jonah had confessed privately years before. Others said the necklace was planted to divert blame. Red herrings layered over red herrings, until no one could say what truth remained. In Clara's notes, she wrote, "Late emergence of evidence reshaped suspicion. Necklace as anchor for gossip, not proof." She recognized how the case itself mirrored the duality of the hollow, an open space filled by silence, where both fact and myth claimed territory. The sheriff's file gained a supplemental entry. Evidence box discovered at archives, items logged. Nothing more, no charges, no further inquiry. The necklace, the ticket, the program, all absorbed into paper trails without consequence. At the Mercer home, Martha was too frail to speak much. When Clara visited, she showed the archivist her bundles of programs tied with twine. "Everyone is a year she's been gone," she whispered. Clara thought of the word faith written in blue ink on Exhibit 12A. She didn't know if Lydia had written it, or if someone else had scrawled it after. But the echo was undeniable. Faith stacked in drawers, faith smeared in evidence, faith eroded by time. That evening, Clara walked once more to the hollow. Mist hung low across the stream bed. She carried a copy of the archival photograph of the necklace, holding it against the air as though measuring it to the valley itself. No answers rose. Only the hum of insects and the faint smell of rust. The necklace sat sealed in plastic. The ticket faded. The program dissolved slowly in its sleeve, yet the suspicion burned hotter than before. Jonah Pike had become a name tied not by proof, but by the weight of rumor fed by forgotten artifacts. The tarnished chain gleamed faintly under sterile light, the initial unreadable. By the early 2010s, forensic science had caught up to what the 1990s could not. DNA databases expanded, labs now capable of extracting profiles from fragments once considered useless. Clara Rowe petitioned the state to re-examine every sealed item from the Mercer case. Months later, she received a small padded envelope in the mail, stamped with the return address of the state forensic unit. Inside was a single-page report. The hair found snagged on the branch near the hollow was tested first. Results: female, adolescent, no match to known relatives of Lydia Mercer. The wording was precise and cold. Whoever the hair belonged to, it was not Lydia. Clara read the line twice, then 3 more times. A clue that should have confirmed identity instead deepened the void. Next came the burnt fabric collected by the Collins boys. Analysts confirmed traces of industrial lubricant, consistent with mining equipment, but added that human epithelial cells were detected. Female, partial profile, again not matching Lydia. A second girl, nameless, without record. The hollow had given back fragments of someone, but not the girl everyone had been searching for. Clara pressed the report flat on her desk. In her notes she wrote, "The hollow holds more than one absence." The sheriff's office filed the report under no action. Without a name to link the samples, the findings were treated as anomalies. The case remained cold, unsolved, unshaken. Yet for the town, whispers returned. Some claimed the hollow had taken multiple girls, that Lydia was only the latest. Others said the new DNA proved outsiders had trespassed into the valley, and the hollow punished them. Belief filled where science hesitated. Attention turned once again to Jonah Pike. If the necklace bore his initial, and if Lydia's DNA was nowhere in the samples, perhaps the artifacts were planted. Clara interviewed him a second time. He looked older, his voice slower, but the defensiveness remained. "They'll pin it on me till I'm in the ground," he muttered. "That chain, anyone could have put it there." He offered no alibi, only bitterness. The reemergence of evidence decades late had done nothing but keep his name in circulation. Clara recognized the pattern. Red herrings disguised as answers. The necklace, the hair, the burnt fabric, all fragments pointing nowhere certain. She logged them carefully, each in her catalog of artifacts, but understood their greater role was feeding silence. Meanwhile, the church programs continued their evolution. In Martha's home, bundles grew brittle. Some pages yellowed. Others carried faint smudges of wax from candles. Clara handled them with gloves, surprised to find that a few had been stamped by mildew, creating dark halos around the hymn titles. "They're all I've got," Martha whispered. By then, her voice was faint, her movements slow. She showed Clara one particular bundle tied with blue ribbon. Inside, the programs each bore Lydia's name handwritten at the top. An ordinary object had transformed through repetition into something more than ritual, a private archive, a testimony that no one else could refute. The contrast sharpened. In the evidence room, sealed bags, lab reports, words like "no match." In Martha's living room, paper bundles tied with ribbon, words like "faith" written in fading ink. Two systems of record, both incomplete, both unable to summon a missing girl back from the hollow. Clara met with Dr. Whitaker, a forensic analyst who had handled the modern tests. "Science doesn't erase folklore," he told her. "It only changes the shadows." He showed her the graph of alleles, peaks, and numbers without names. Clara stared at the jagged lines. They were proof of someone, but without identity they became another myth. Data as ghost. The sheriff's file grew heavier with contradiction. DNA that didn't match. Objects that pointed but didn't prove. Clara added photocopies of her own notes, layering belief beside fact, unwilling to let either vanish. By the end of that year, the town returned to silence. The hollow remained fenced only by rumor. Children avoided it. Teenagers dared each other. Hunters steered clear. The artifacts sat in climate-controlled drawers, Martha's programs in a sagging house. Lydia herself remained as absent as ever. Clara's final note for the chapter read, "Forensics says she is not here. Belief says she never left." The DNA peak stood sharp on paper, a ghost without a name. By 2015, the case had slipped almost entirely into memory. For the sheriff's office, it was a closed drawer in the evidence room, pulled only when new officers asked about the valley. For the town, it was a wound kept quiet, spoken of rarely, wrapped in stories of curses rather than crime. Yet Clara Rowe pressed on, convinced there were voices left to hear. She sought out Walter Reeve, one of the oldest men still living near the hollow. His house leaned at the end of a dirt road, porch sagging, curtains yellowed. He welcomed her in with a shake of his head. "They never wanted me to say what I saw," he muttered. Sitting in a dim kitchen, Walter described the night of the fair. He had been walking home late, bottle in hand, when he paused by the ridge. The hollow lay black against the stars. He swore he saw movement. First Lydia stepping into the trees, then two figures following close behind. Not shadows, not tricks. Two people, taller than her, keeping pace. When Clara asked if he knew them, Walter shook his head. "Could have been boys, could have been men, faces hidden, but I know I saw them." He claimed he told deputies at the time, but no report was filed. "They didn't want more trouble," he said bitterly. Easier to blame the hollow than their own. To Clara, this was a pivotal moment. Belief and fact colliding. Folklore had painted the hollow as a hungry place, but Walter offered a human image. Two figures moving behind a girl. It was detail without proof, testimony without follow-up, lingering for decades only in his memory. Before she left, Walter opened a drawer and handed her a folded slip of paper. It was another church program from the night of the fair, the edges browned, the ink faded. "I kept it," he said, "because it felt like hers. Found it by the creek next morning." Clara studied the page. Across the corner, faint pencil marks curved like initials, though too smeared to read. Another scrap of paper, half artifact, half omen. She logged it carefully, marking its chain of custody as broken, unreliable. Yet she could not dismiss the weight of holding it. The paper trembled in her hands like a voice half-spoken. Rumors revived in town after Walter's story spread. Some believed his account proved Lydia had been chased, abducted, hidden far from the hollow. Others said his years and failing memory disqualified him. Still others clung to the curse, insisting the two figures were specters of the miners lost underground. The divide widened again. Belief bending the story one way, forensic record bending it another. Sheriff's files, by contrast, remained static. When Clara requested any notes on Walter's testimony, she received only silence. The official log contained no entry, no sketch, no acknowledgement. It was as though his memory had been erased at the moment it mattered most. Yet Clara sketched the scene herself. Lydia stepping into trees, two shadows following, the lantern glow shrinking. She clipped the sketch into her notes, labeling it Vision Unfiled, Possible Truth, Possible Echo. By then, Martha Mercer was fading. She spent her days in a chair by the window, the bundles of church programs stacked around her like walls. Clara visited one afternoon, showing her the slip Walter had given. Martha touched the edge with trembling fingers. "They keep coming back to me," she whispered. "Paper never leaves, even when people do." For Clara, the symbol's evolution was complete. The church program had moved from ordinary handout to ritual offering, to forensic artifact, and now to heirloom passed hand to hand as though carrying memory itself. Belief and fact still refused to merge. Walter's two figures could not be proven. The smudged initials on the program could not be verified. The DNA from the hollow did not match Lydia. Each piece circled, refusing to settle. Clara ended her notes for that year with a line that captured the stalemate. The hollow consumes evidence as it consumes names. It gives back fragments, but never certainty. That winter, snow pressed into the ridges again. The trail grew slick, the stones black with ice. Children avoided it altogether, no longer daring each other. The hollow remained quiet, a silence louder than answers. Two shadows moved behind her, their faces never drawn. By the time Clara Rowe reached the end of her work, decades had passed since the summer fair. The ridges were unchanged, thick woods, thin trails, streams trickling into the valley. But the town had altered. Younger families knew the story only as rumor. Children grew up hearing not Lydia's name, but the phrase, "The hollow will take you." The girl had been absorbed into legend. Clara's last stop was the State Archive building, a chilled room of metal shelves and numbered boxes. The Mercer file waited in a cabinet, its spine frayed, its pages swollen from humidity. She laid out the contents across a long table, the canvas shoe in its sealed bag, the brown hair in a plastic vial, the strip of burnt fabric folded inside paper, the silver chain tarnished to green, the torn fare ticket, and the damp church program logged as Exhibit 12A. Spread before her, the artifacts looked less like evidence than relics. Each carried weight beyond what science had measured. The shoe, ordinary canvas, had become a symbol of disappearance. The hair, once assumed to be Lydia's, now pointed to an unknown girl, an echo of absence within absence. The fabric smelled faintly of oil even after years, a reminder of machines that once dug the valley hollow. The chain, with its engraved J, still cast suspicion without proof. The ticket, smudged with half a lyric, looked like nothing and everything. And the church program, edges warped, still bore the faint word faith. She logged them one by one, noting their chain of custody. Yet the more she cataloged, the clearer it became that the case remained unsolved, not because evidence was lacking, but because evidence and belief had never aligned. Each fragment pulled the story in a different direction. Science produced numbers, peaks, and negatives. Folklore produced curses, rituals, and whispers. Between the two lay Lydia, forever missing. Martha Mercer had died by then. Her house was cleared by relatives, and bundles of church programs were delivered to the archive in cardboard boxes. Clara examined them with gloves, astonished at the volume. Hundreds of folded slips, many with Lydia's name scrawled at the top. Some bundles tied with ribbon, others bound by string. Taken together, they weighed nearly as much as the official evidence box. The line between ritual and record had blurred beyond distinction. In her report, Clara wrote, "The symbol has completed its passage. Paper as ordinary object, then prayer, then forensic artifact, now heirloom archived." The hollow consumed the girl, but the town produced paper. That is what remains. The sheriff's office closed the file with a final entry. Case inactive, no further leads. No charges were ever brought. Jonah Pike grew old, still carrying the weight of rumor. Elias Boone died in his cabin, journals stacked in piles. Walter Reeves' memory dimmed until he could no longer describe the two shadows he once swore he saw. Each witness faded, leaving only paper and silence. Clara stood in the archive, surrounded by shelves, listening to the hum of fluorescent light. She realized the hollow had won not by hiding a body, but by multiplying fragments until no one could tell where truth began. She boxed the items carefully, sealed the lid, and marked the number. When she slid the carton back onto the shelf, it joined thousands of others. Cold cases stacked like graves in paper form. Her last words in the manuscript were spare. In the end, the hollow was not only a place, it was a silence that spread into every drawer, every file, every prayer slip. It held Lydia Mercer, and it held everything that tried to name her absence. The file remains unsolved. The hollow remains closed by nothing but fear, and in a sealed evidence bag, a folded church program lies flat, its ink fading, logged forever as Exhibit 12A. The paper sleeps in cold storage, its word faith barely visible.